Hello, I'm Petr, and welcome to my introduction to Czech grammar. This video will introduce you to the Czech verb system. Now, I'm not pretending this is something you can actually learn from. Gone are the days when a teacher would present his students with a heap of paradigm tables and tell them, memorize this, expecting them to master the target language by memorizing alone. So no, this is not meant as a teaching method. I know better. What I'm doing here is presenting in a general, concise, and hopefully understandable way what you're going to be dealing with when or if you decide to learn Czech. I have tons more content dealing with each specific thing that I discuss in this video, so you can delve in more depth into whatever interests / bothers you about Czech verbs. For those of you who don't know me yet, I'm Petr Kurfürst. I'm Czech, born in Czechia back in 1977. I'm a professional English teacher and English to Czech translator and English and Czech proofreader. And I enjoy teaching people Czech and explaining about Czech pronunciation and grammar. I make several series of videos that are dedicated to Czech pronunciation, Czech grammar, and Czech vocabulary. If you like what I'm doing, subscribe to my channel to see more and turn on the notification so you won't miss any new videos. Czech is a Slavic language, and that means you're up against some serious grammar. Slavic languages, for example Czech, Slovak, Polish, Russian, Ukrainian, Bulgarian, and Serbo-Croatian, to name a few, have quite complex grammar systems. And unfortunately, unlike, say, Hungarian or Finnish, these systems are not perfectly logical. What I mean to say is there are prefixes and suffixes, and each prefix or suffix may perform many different functions. Many different functions. It look the same. This may be confusing at first, to say the least. So my goal here is to show you how Czech verbs behave so that you can guess more easily what a given verb form means when you next see it. The Czech verb system then. Czech verbs are conjugated to express three different tenses: past, present, and future. They can show four moods: indicative, imperative, infinitive, and conditional. Each Czech verb has, by default, one of two aspects, either the imperfective or the perfective. I'll explain what all these words mean in detail in a bit, but first let me throw a couple more technical terms at you. Czech verbs can be conjugated for one of three persons in either the singular or the plural, that's two numbers, and verbs in the past tense have to be declined into one of the three Czech genders: the feminine, the masculine, or the neuter. This is mandatory. There's only one auxiliary verb in the Czech language with four different uses and countless modal verbs, but luckily these behave just like any ordinary Czech verbs. There are 7 irregular verbs, but some of them only have irregular imperatives and otherwise are perfectly well behaved, so they're not a big deal, and I'm not going to mention them again in this video. Making a negative verb in Czech could not be easier. In fact, I don't think there even is a simpler way than the one we use in the Slavic language family. If you know of any less complicated way of expressing negation in other languages, let me know in the comments. In addition to all the normal verbs, which are always one word, there are lots of so-called reflexive verbs, which consist of 2 words. The tenses then. The most basic, most commonly used is the present tense. All Czech verbs fall into one of 3 classes in the present tense, depending on the final vowel, a bit like Spanish does. Each class contains approximately the same number of verbs, so you can't say one is dominant or less common or anything. The 3 classes are as follows: a verbs, e verbs, and e verbs. The vowel in question, either a or e or e, appears in the third person singular indicative, that is to say he, she, or it does. So we have, for example, dělá, mluví, and bere. Remember how I said the verbs can be conjugated into 3 persons in 2 numbers? That's the first person singular, I do, the second person singular, you do, the third person singular, he, she, or it does, and then the first person plural, we do, the second person plural, you do, and the third person plural, they do. The first class will be conjugated in the persons as follows. Dělám, děláš, dělá, that's the basic A form, the shortest, and then děláme, děláte, dělají. Notice the long A in all the forms, but in the third person plural where it's shortened to A. The second class is similar to the first one, only A is replaced by E. Mluvím, mluvíš, mluví, mluvíme, mluvíte, mluví. Apparently both third persons are the same. In some dialects, however, mluvějí is used instead to maintain the singular plural distinction. The third class again takes a slightly different set of endings. Beru, bereš, bere, bereme, berete, berou. You may have noticed that the first person singular here doesn't end with an m, like it does in dělám and mluvím. Notice also that all the verb endings are short vowels in this class. So these are the present indicative forms. The other modes are the imperative, the infinitive, and the conditional. We'll leave the conditional for the end because it shares several elements with the past tense. Imperative mood. The imperative is formed quite easily from the present indicative forms. For the are verbs, the imperative replaces the final are with a for the second person singular, and then you add the corresponding plural forms to that. Ultimately, you have dělej for you, one person do, dělejme for let us do, and dělejte for you, more persons do. In the second class, the e verbs, the shortest imperative, identical to the stem of the verb, is simply made by removing the final vowel. So we have mluv, mluvme, and mluvte. The exceptions are words whose stem ends in two or more consonants, such as čistí, where the imperative has an extra vowel for clarity. Čisti, čistěme, čistěte. And verbs whose stem has a long vowel, like hází, which take the a ending from the R class. So we have házej, házejme, házejte. In the third class, which is a little unusual already, has no m in the first person singular, remember, the imperative is again formed by removing the e vowel. Ber, berme, berte. Where this differs from the second class is that some final consonants of the verb stem are palatalized. This is called softening in Czech. Thus, from jede we have jeď, jeďme, jeďte. From půjde we have pojď, pojďme, pojďte. Also, where the stem ends with two or more consonants, we use an additional vowel. Začne turns in the imperative forms into začni, začněme, začněte. The infinitive form, or mood, is the one used after modals and in the future tense of imperfective verbs. It expresses no grammatical categories whatsoever. It's no person, no tense, nothing. It's like the stone form of the verb. And it is the one you find in dictionaries. The relationship between the present form and the infinitive is not so straightforward, but there are at least some useful rules. For the are verbs, the infinitive is most commonly the same form ending in at. So from dělá, the infinitive is dělat. Analogously for hledá, it is hledat, and so on. For the e verbs, the infinitive is often like the former case, ending in it. Thus, for mluví, it is mluvit. For zkusí, it is zkusit. Unfortunately, this is not always the rule. The infinitives of some e verbs end in et, for example, sedí, sedět, or even at, as in spí, spát. For this class of verbs, the only useful advice is to memorize both the present form and the infinitive. For the third class of verbs, the e verbs, the situation is even more complicated. Their infinitives have a wide range of forms. The only reliable fact is that every Czech infinitive ends in the consonant t. Again, memorizing the infinitive form for each verb in this category is probably the best, though there exists a system under which this class is subdivided into 12 subclasses, each with a defined infinitive form. The only really certain subclass is verbs that end in uje, such as děkuje and kupuje, where the infinitive is invariably ovat, děkovat, kupovat, etc. The past tense is quite predictably formed from the infinitive. The infinitive t is replaced with a l. So, for verbs whose infinitive ends in at, the past form is al, etc. But unfortunately, that's not all, because verbs in the past have to show the person and also, for some reason, the gender. To express the person, we use the present forms of the auxiliary být, which are as follows: sem, si, je, sme, ste, so. Only in the third person, the auxiliary is not used. So we get dělal jsem, dělal si, dělal, dělali jsme, dělali jste, dělali. Notice how the past verbs changes in the plural? An extra I is attached to the L form for these plurals. These are all the masculine forms, used for masculine subjects. In the third person, for instance, Václav dělal. The first person singular is used when the speaker is masculine, that is, a male. The second person singular is used to address a male listener. The plural forms are used either for purely masculine groups or for mixed gender groups. The feminine forms have a different set of final vowels on the past form. Dělala jsem, dělala si, dělala, dělali jsme, dělali jste, dělali. Analogously, the first person singular is used by female speakers, and the second person singular addresses a female listener. Unlike with the plural masculine forms, which may cover both genders, the plural feminine forms only relate to feminine persons and things. In pronunciation, the written forms dělali and dělali sound exactly the same, except in a few dialects in Czech Silesia. The neuter forms again have a different set of final vowels. Dělalo jsem, dělalo si, dělalo, dělala jsme, dělala jste, dělala. Predominantly, only the third person singular form is encountered in conversations. In colloquial speech, the auxiliary si, second person singular, is often reduced and absorbed into the past verb form as a suffix s, thus dělals, dělalas. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel to see more. Turn on the notifications so you won't miss any new ones, and like and comment to help with the algorithm. Also, if you have any suggestions for me on what to improve or include or talk about in the future, please let me know. This is very valuable and welcome input and feedback. Now is a good time to mention the arguably most difficult aspect of the Czech verb system for non-Slavic learners. I'm speaking about the imperfective versus perfective aspect. The naked truth is that every conceivable verb in the Czech language exists in two completely and utterly separate life forms. Any activity, state, movement, etc. that can be expressed with a verb can, and actually must, be expressed as either an imperfective activity, state, movement, etc., or as a perfective one. Things get complicated when the aspect combines with tenses. First of all, what the dickens am I talking about? Consider the following pair of statements in English. I wrote a message to Jessica, and I was writing a message to Jessica. In the first sentence, the activity is regarded as either completed or having happened once. In the second sentence, you are taking the listener into the middle of the activity, making the listener feel that the writing either took some time or was in progress. So the two sentences differ not in the meaning as such, but in the aspect. If such statements were made in the Czech language, the first would be called perfective and the second imperfective. Perfective verbs can also be used to express that something happened more than once. I wrote 10 messages to Jessica. This implies that you wrote them consecutively, one after the other. Imperfective verbs, on the other hand, give one the feeling of simultaneousness. The kids were each drawing a different dragon. Here you can imagine several kids doing the same activity simultaneously. In Czech, virtually every action has two verbs assigned to it. One is always imperfective, the other perfective. An example, jdu do školy. I'm going to school. This is happening right now, so we have a progressive tense in English and a perfective verb in Czech. On the other hand, chodím do školy is I go to school, a habitual action. In English, you have the simple present form of the same verb, I'm going, I go. In Czech, you use a different verb altogether, an imperfective one. Thus, jdu and chodím are two different verbs, the former inherently perfective, the latter inherently imperfective. Jdu and chodím are an extreme case. However, there are not many such pairs where the two verbs would be totally different. Most pairs are similar to each other and either differ in the vowels of the stem only, as in chodím versus házím, or also belong to different verb classes with different personal endings, as in koupím and kupuju. Very often, verbal prefixes play a crucial role here. Typically, the imperfective verb has no prefixes, and there is one perfective prefix for the basic meaning, as in dělám, udělám, or hraju, zahraju, or píšu, napíšu. This one basic perfective prefix doesn't change the meaning of the verb, just its aspect. So the above pairs each mean virtually the same thing, only in different aspects. However, very many verbal prefixes exist in Czech that do change the verb's meaning, which is their primary function. In such cases, the prefixed verbs having an altered or modified meaning are perfective. For example, dodělám, prohraju, or podepíšu. To be able to express the same meanings in the imperfective aspect, what the Czech language does is it invents a third form called progressive, which it uses as imperfective with prefixes. Thus, we have forms like dodělávám, prohrávám, or podepisuju. Some of these progressive forms are in turn used without prefixes to denote that an activity happens regularly, periodically, repetitively. So ultimately we gain verbs like dělávám and hrávám. Why I'm mentioning all this in the future tense chapter will become obvious soon. Perfective and imperfective verbs have different rules for forming the future tense. In fact, the present tense of perfective verbs is already the future tense. Thus, udělám čaj actually means I will make tea or I'm going to make tea. This is when there's a no time marker in the sentence or if there's a future time marker like tomorrow. You can use these perfective verbs with a present time marker to denote habitual actions. Každý večer udělám čaj or občas udělám čaj. Well, these have almost exactly the same meaning as their imperfective counterpart. Imperfective verbs form the future tense by combining the only real future tense in Czech, which is that of the verb být, to be, with their infinitive mood. The person marker in these forms is on the auxiliary, as the infinitive lacks the ability to express person. Thus, we have budu dělat, budeš dělat, bude dělat, budeme dělat, budete dělat, budou dělat. Just to clarify the issue, the past tense is formed in exactly the same way for both perfective and imperfective verbs. Thus, dělal jsem, udělal jsem, psali jste, napsali jste, točilo, natočilo, etc. There are two types of conditional moods in Czech, the present conditional and the past conditional. But there's no distinction between reales and irreales in this case. The present conditional looks a lot like the past tense, only the forms of the auxiliary verb are different. Dělal bych, dělal bys, dělal by, dělali bychom, dělali byste, dělali by. Notice that even the third persons get an auxiliary here, unlike in the past tense where they are just one word. And analogously to the past tense, the conditional also distinguishes between the genders. So here too, we get dělala bych for a female speaker, dělala bys for a female listener, etc. The past conditional forms are a combination of three words. The main verb in the L form, identical to the past tense, preceded by two different forms of the auxiliary být. These combine into an array of forms such as byl bych dělal, byl bys dělal, byl by dělal, byli bychom dělali, byli byste dělali, and byli by dělali. In the feminine gender, all the L are extended to la for byla, bych, dělala, etc. And in the neuter, the L turns into lo, bylo by, dělalo. So we have the three tenses covered, present, past, future. We have the moods covered, indicative, imperative, infinitive, and conditional. And we have the aspects dealt with, perfective and imperfective. you have seen many forms of the only Czech auxiliary být already, which is the present forms jsem, si, jsme, jste, which are used paradoxically to form the past tense. The past forms byl, byla, bylo, byli, byli, byla, used for the past conditional. The archaic preterite forms bych, bys, by, bychom, byste, by, used to form the conditional. And the future forms budu, budeš, bude, budeme, budete, budou. The future construction for imperfective verbs. To add a few more, there are also je and so, which are the actual third person singular and plural present indicative forms, used to say that something or someone is or are, and the imperatives, buď, buďme, buďte, used for the imperatives. Buď tak laskav, buďte tady v 8 hodin. The negative form of any verb is simply made by adding the prefix ne to the very start of the verb or verb phrase. Thus, in the present tense we have nedělám, nemluvíš, nejdeme, etc. In the past tense we have nedělal jsem, nemluvila si, nedotknulo, etc. The same goes for the conditional. Nedělal bych, nemluvila bys, nedotknulo by, etc. In the future tense of the perfective words, ne is obviously added to the main verb. There is none other. Neudělám, nezahraju, nepokusíte, etc. In the future tense of imperfective verbs, ne is added to the conjugated auxiliary, not the infinitive. Nebudu čekat, nebudeme sedět, nebudou péci. The negative imperative can normally only be expressed for the imperfective aspect. For imperfective verbs, the affirmative and negative imperatives only differ in the ne prefix. However, for the perfective affirmative imperative, jdi, the negative is nechoď. For hoď, it is neházej. Analogously, for zahraj, it is nehraj. For napiš, it is nepiš. You see what the ne prefix does for verbs with a perfective suffix? It replaces the perfective suffix, rendering the negative verb imperfective again. However, for verbs with other prefixes than those that form the perfective aspect, the negative prefix is added to the perfective prefix, but the stem of the verb changes into the progressive stem. Neprohrávej, nepodepisuj. The ordinary stem is only used for admonitions, warnings, or negative advice. Neprohraj, nezlom, or for expressing the actual opposite of the negative. That is, a sense that one has to do what the verb does. Nekup, nepodepiš, actually meaning kup, podepiš. Most Czech verbs can express reflexivity by adding the reflexive pronoun, also sometimes called the impersonal pronoun. This has two forms, one for the direct object, this is the accusative case, se, and another for the indirect object, the dative case, si. The choice of the form depends on the meaning of the verb. The reflexive form can also express mutuality or reciprocation. Thus, umít is used when washing an object, umít si is used when washing one's own body parts, and umít se is used when washing oneself or when more people wash each other or one another. There are many verbs that are reflexive by nature in all their forms. These often have to do with emotions or bodily processes. Examples are bát se, smát se, or usmívat se. The verb is never used without the pronoun. Bát, smát, or usmívat mean nothing at all. The reflexive pronouns do not change for different persons or numbers. Thus, bojím se, bojíš se, bojí se, bojíme se, bojíte se, bojí se. They are used with every form of the verb. Bál jsem se, bál bych se, byl bych se bál, budu se bát, and even in the negative form. Nebál jsem se, nebál bych se, nebyl bych se bál, nebudu se bát, etc. As for the position of the reflexive pronoun and the auxiliary verb within the sentence, that is an issue with the enclitic system, not verbs. And I cover that in my video, Czech enclitic system. Well, that's about all I can say about the Czech verbs, really. They have tenses, moods, and aspects. They can be easily negated. They can and sometimes must be reflexive. And there's one auxiliary verb. We covered all that, and I hope my introduction to the Czech verb system has helped you get a grasp of how Czech verbs behave. If you liked my video, please subscribe to my channel to see more, turn on the notifications so you won't miss any new ones, and like and comment to help me with the algorithm. If you have any verb related questions, please ask me in the comments. And you can also leave me a comment with how easy or difficult you find learning Czech verbs. Thank you and enjoy my other videos.